Greetings and bienvenue, Midnight Crew. Thank you for returning to this broadcast. And welcome to new viewers joining us for the first time. If you like a video, then feel free to subscribe.
First, I don't have all the details. There's obviously a greater story here, a bigger picture, and I've only had a small glimpse of it. An experience that lasted for only a few short minutes, with the event constituting maybe 45 seconds. But I can't explain what happened in those 45 seconds, can't wrap my head around it, or reconcile it with what I know about the natural world and life, specifically the potential for life's development when not checked by some ever-present environmental stressor or predator. A few years ago, I got a call from my brother in Arizona asking if I wanted to visit, maybe do a little hiking, eat at some Mexican restaurants he thought I'd like, etc. He'd just gotten some big bonus at work and wanted to spend it on some brotherly time. I had a few vacation days saved up at work, so I agreed and took the necessary time off. Nothing of interest happened on the way there, and we met without any issue. He showed me around Phoenix, Temp, and Chandler, and treated me to some food. 2 days went by and we branched out in our explorations of the state, visiting Sedona and a few other areas. I was set to leave on the 3rd when he suggested that we end my stay doing something outside. We'd already gone hiking, but he wanted to do another outdoorsy thing since he knew I wouldn't be able to once I went back home, where the weather was snowy, rainy. We found a decent place to camp for a day in southern Arizona, somewhat near the border, not far off from where we had hiked the day before. With Arizona being a desert, there was plenty of land and open space for us to spread out our stuff and relax. The drive there, which lasted a couple of hours, gave us time to chat and listen to the few bands we mutually enjoyed. We brought the usual camping supplies, tents, food and water, flashlights, flares, a radio, etc. It was just one day, an evening, and a night, really, so we only brought the basic, for example, cheapest necessities. His truck was parked about half a mile away from the campsite to preserve the camping atmosphere, whilst keeping it at a reasonably accessible and visible distance. We spent most of the evening just talking, catching up on anything we hadn't covered the first 2 days, and eating the leftover food we'd saved from past restaurant dinners. There was no one else out that we could see, and the nearest road was about 2 miles from where we had parked the car. It was mostly flat desert in every direction, a cozy desolation. Around 10 p.m., just after we had finished dinner and gathered up our trash, we both saw something off to the north, about half a mile from camp. A mound in the desert, but one that moved, seeming to inch toward us every few seconds. Not continuously, but in steady lurches, as if the energy or effort for each motion needed to be mustered. The mound was the same color as the sand, but even from the distance we had initially spotted it, we could tell that it wasn't made up of sand. The surface, while sand-colored, was fuzzy in a way that was highly uncomfortable to look at for more than a few seconds. I remember turning to my brother and seeing him wince and rub his eyes. I'd had the urge to do the same. For whatever reason, a mixture of awe and fear, maybe, we stayed put, didn't move until the thing was only a few yards away. At that distance, the size of the thing finally registered to me. It was huge, an immense body that towered over us. I'm sure the sheer flatness of the area made it seem larger than it really was, but sitting before it, looking up at this wall of uncanny fuzziness, really gave the impression of enormity. I've spoken with my brother several times since then, and each time we try to recall and describe the thing, we come up with new descriptions. Not necessarily new details, but new forms, structures. We generally tend to settle on the admittedly odd description of a huge and dry washcloth. One that's been thoroughly used and left out for quite some time, scaled well beyond usable proportions. A haphazard shape, not necessarily formless, but spread out. Another description, one I offered, was a hideously blossoming flower. The ugly petals unfurled, some larger than others, but without any uniform center. There were no eyes, no feelers, antennae or identifiable sense organs. Only the massive, ever-mobile body. If given the means, the easiest way I could replicate the thing's overall structure would be if I were to take a ball of light brown clay or dough, pull at it in every direction, and then insert tiny, almost microscopic pins all over its surface. Thousands of them. Then, somehow, make those pins vibrate, and give the dough itself a sort of buzzing, almost breath-like animation. I know it sounds ridiculous, but that's honestly the clearest idea I can give, the best reproduction of how the thing idled. We stared at it without speaking, both feeling something more than just basic fear. When it got really, uncomfortably close, I felt sick, not queasy or nauseous, but more like delirious. As if being in close proximity to it had caused some sort of sudden neurological issue. While I didn't recognize it at the time, looking back now, I'm certain that my mind had simply been unable or independently unwilling to fully grasp the thing's appearance. It was so unusual, so unprecedented. One of the parts, tentacles, tendrils, even the more general term appendages all feel weirdly inaccurate. Drifted by me in what could have been a missed attempt at contact, or simply another motion of self-propulsion, and I felt the space around me shift, get pulled away in the wake of the part. I was suddenly aware, acutely, intimately aware of the space I occupied, somehow became highly sensitive to the particles or whatever, and noticed, palpably, how the stuff of that space had been drawn away from me. This interaction, phenomenon, whatever you want to call it, scared me more than the sight of the creature itself. The revelation that it could somehow subtract or brush aside the elements, the essence of the air, was absolutely terrifying. I heard my brother utter and then quickly stifle a cry, and turned toward him just in time to see the passage of another part over his head, this one much larger than the one that had swept by me. The thing was now over us, and I expected to find teeth or a gaping maw or something like that beneath it. I think, at the time, I had mentally associated its appearance with that of an octopus, or a starfish, some multi-legged, water-inhabiting creature, but having thought about it a lot, I can confidently say that neither is close enough for a worthwhile comparison. Their anatomies are too ordered. But there was just more of the same beneath it. More of that pulsing, buzzing, prickly flesh, which was so disconcerting to look at it. Since it hadn't tried to eat or attack us, I got the idea that maybe it couldn't see or sense us, so I turned to my brother and mouthed, "Don't move." He didn't nod or mouth anything back, but it was obvious that he'd already decided to stay still, likely out of sheer terror. We've had our disagreements about the exact amount of time we spent beneath it, but agree that the thing's passage took between 20 and 45 seconds. It had felt much longer than 20 seconds to me, maybe because I was so hyper-aware of it, of its bizarreness in relation to myself. I think my brother had been numb to his perception of time while the thing passed over him. It had obviously affected us differently. I didn't turn around immediately, actually waited several minutes before even turning to my brother. When I did, I saw him breathing slowly, rhythmically, obviously trying to calm himself down. I, on the other hand, was weirdly relaxed, at least in an immediate physical sense. Terrified, sure, but I had been so thoroughly scared by the thing's unwholesome and unprecedented nature that my mind essentially said, "The heck with it," and put me into a kind of blissfully apathetic state. Like, why even worry, why waste the effort of being hysterical, with something like that roaming around? Why run, you'll just die tired, etc. When we finally turned around, there was nothing to be seen. Just the same flat desert we had gazed upon earlier in the day. I saw the truck, just where we'd parked it, and that was the only sizable thing in sight for miles. The sand before and behind was disturbed as if something inordinately large had rolled, crawled, and swept by, all actions at once, but there were no droppings, no slime, nothing to specifically, empirically attest to the creature's presence. We actually spent the rest of the night out there, speaking to one another only when we needed something, a bottle of water, a bag of jerky, etc. We'd brought a radio, but neither of us bothered to use it. I had my earphones but didn't take them out or use my phone for anything. Having just witnessed something so profoundly weird, there wasn't anything on the internet that could have amused, entertained, or intrigued me. We both, for hours, sat in silence. I remember sleeping, but couldn't tell you if I dreamed. My brother never mentioned dreaming on that night, either. In the morning we packed up our things, quietly walked back to the truck, and then drove back to his house. We had a farewell breakfast at a diner not too far from the airport, and then I flew back home. We didn't discuss the experience until almost a year later, both having needed time to process our thoughts. It wasn't like seeing a wild animal, or a car crash, or a building collapse, or anything worldly, mundane. There was an element of the unreal to it, something beyond the natural order of the earth and man's own creations. But at the same time, the thing had seemed so comfortable with our world, so relaxed and assured of its place among a planet of insects, wolves, starfish, and humans. I don't know what we saw, but I do know that's probably the last time I'll ever visit Arizona.
This might seem unbelievable to some people, but it is 100% true. It is burned into my memory and I will never forget it, even the small details. I present it to you exactly as it happened. I grew up in the high deserts and mountains of southeast Idaho. Most of my life has been spent outdoors, whether I was on the back of a horse pushing cattle for local ranchers or hunting elk, or on foot hunting rabbits and deer through the sagebrush. I was given my first .22 rifle when I was 9 years old and spent every minute I could out in the lava flows hunting rabbits, rock chucks, and sage hen. I remember several times that my mother or father would drop me and my best friend off somewhere along the lavas and pick us up at the same spot 3 or 4 days later after many miles of exploring and living off the land. All we would take is water, shells, and a knife. When I got older and had my own vehicles, my trips got longer and farther into the desert. As I write this, I can smell the sagebrush and feel the desert sun on my face. Suffice to say, I love that Idaho desert more than any place on earth. I feel more comfortable out in the desert, 30 miles from the closest person, than I do in my own living room. During the summer of 2001, I was south and slightly east of the Big Southern Butte. I had spent a couple of days looking for arrowheads. Everything had been pretty normal. I walked for miles, found a few arrowheads, saw a few coyotes and deer, pretty normal. At this time in my life, I always had my dog with me. He was a huge Chesapeake retriever that weighed over 100 pounds. He was very protective of me and my belongings, and was meaner than hell to anybody who acted suspicious or threatening. His surly demeanor towards anybody who messed with me or my stuff earned him the name Kane with my family and friends. The name stuck. Kane loved to go anywhere I went. He loved to go out to the desert and run around, never getting too far away from me. I always felt very secure with him around because he had proved time and time again that he was aware of every living thing that approached us out in the desert. And if that thing was dangerous, whether human or animal, he held no qualms about tearing right into the middle of them. In fact, he enjoyed it. Anyway, we made it back to the pickup truck an hour or so before it got dark. I gathered up some juniper branches and sagebrush to make a fire. I cooked up some dinner for my dog and I and then settled into my hammock for the night. There is nothing better than sleeping in a hammock while outdoors. Unfortunately, we don't have a lot of trees in the desert, so I would find a juniper or fence post, park my pickup close to it and tie one end of my hammock to the pickup bed and one end to the tree or fence post. I spent many comfortable nights rigged up like this. This night was no different. I climbed into my hammock and was soon asleep. A couple of hours later I woke up to raindrops. It had started raining pretty hard and I was getting pretty wet. I quickly threw all of my gear into my hammock, untied the end from the fence post, rolled it up with everything inside it, and tossed it into the back of my pickup with a tarp over it to keep it dry. With all of my gear safely stowed, Kane and I crawled into the cab of the pickup and settled in for a dry, if cramped, rest of the night. Around 3 a.m. in the morning a strange sound woke me up. I was reclined back as best I could in the driver's seat and Kane was sitting up alert on the passenger side. He was growling very softly, and the hair on his shoulders and neck was standing straight up. A very menacing and intimidating sight. I am glad he was on my side. He was looking over my shoulder out the driver's side window. It was his quiet growling that woke me up. I didn't move but just opened my eyes and looked around by moving my eyes in their sockets. It had stopped raining and the clouds had gone away. The sky was now clear with a bright, almost full moon overhead. It was bright enough that I could see Kane very clearly. I wondered what he was focusing all of his attention on and lifted my hand up in front of his nose. I don't know why I did that, but that's what I did. He never even looked at me, but moved his head to the side so he could continue to watch whatever was out my driver's side window, continuing his quiet, threatening growl. I had never seen Kane so focused on anything the way he was now. It sent a shot of adrenaline through me and I was immediately wide awake. It gave me goosebumps and the hair stood up on my arms and my neck. I was scared to turn my head and look out the window. I wasn't sure that I wanted to see what was outside. I summoned the courage and slowly turned my head to the left and looked out my window. About 50 yards away, slightly behind the truck and slowly working its way closer towards me was a large dark figure. In the bright moonlight I could see that this thing was covered in long, coarse hair. It was walking on 2 legs and moved like a man, but different. Its arms seemed longer, and it kind of had a swaying motion as it walked. The moon shone through the hair around the outside of its body and the dark, solid shape underneath was visible. It was moving in slow steps towards the pickup. Every few steps it would stop, crouch down, and wait a few seconds before moving ahead a couple more steps, exactly as my dad had taught me to do while stalking deer and elk. I have no idea if this creature meant to do me harm, but seeing it move exactly as I did when putting the stalk on a deer, with me as the target of its attention, did not make me feel very warm and fuzzy inside. My mind was in overdrive. Imagine, my reality of what exists and doesn't exist in this world was suddenly and without much fanfare turned upside down. At the same time, for the first time in my life, it would happen many more times in the near future in a crappy place called Iraq, genetically inherited, but deeply buried alarm bells were screaming inside my head. My subconscious recognized the danger and demanded that I do something while at the same time dumping bucket loads of adrenaline into my system. My thoughts jumped immediately to my pistol and in the same instant I remembered that it was rolled up in my hammock in the back of my pickup under a tarp, useless. Not that my pistol would do any good. As this thing got closer I could see that it was big, probably 7 or 8 feet tall and solid. It moved like an animal that is very heavily built but is quick and fast at the same time, like a tiger maybe. Kane had gone from sitting to standing on the seat. His hair was standing straight up and his quiet growl had turned into a savage snarl. What a dog. Here is this monster outside my truck and my dog is ready for me to open the door and turn him loose. My mind quickly switched from fight mode to flight mode. My keys were in the ignition. Without taking my eyes off this thing, I reached up and started the pickup. The creature was less than 30 yards away now. When it heard the engine start, it crouched down lower to the ground than it had crouched before. The top of its pointy head was just above the level of a patch of sagebrush that happened to be between him and me. My pickup was nosed up to a lava rock wall. The only trail out was to my right and behind. There were large lava rocks scattered on the ground, so I had to make an over 180-degree turn while backing up to be lined up with the road. I threw the truck in reverse and floored it by turning on my lights at the same time. As I swung through the turn, my high beams swung right across the creature. It had put its head down, probably to protect it from the glare, and all I saw was the top of its head. I noticed a mass of coarse, dark gray hair before its shape was swallowed by the darkness. I drove down that 2-track desert roadway faster than I normally would. My truck was bouncing over rocks and plowing over sagebrush when the curves were too sharp to take at that speed. Kane and I were bouncing all over the inside. I drove that way for several miles, continuously looking behind me until I calmed down enough to slow down. I drove out to a main road and stopped to mentally go over what I had just seen. But stopping out there in the dark was too much. I ended up cutting my trip short and just went home. This was a long post, but I hoped that I could convey a small amount of the effect that this experience had on me.
Back in the spring of 2016, a few of my friends were talking about their experience with some weird creature in the desert southeast of Tucson near Vail, Arizona. The description sounded a lot like Mothman, though this creature had no wings. I was skeptical, but I didn't want to doubt my friends because whatever this was had really scared them. They said that they believed it was some kind of alien being. Later on that year, in the winter, these sightings were far from my mind. I was visiting a friend who lived in Vail. I stayed over late that evening. At about 2 a.m. I left their house to drive about 25 minutes down I-10 towards home. Driving about 50 miles per hour, when approaching a rise in the road, I saw a silhouette. Before I even processed that I was observing something, I soon realized that I had slowed and eventually stopped on the shoulder to get a better view. It was about 20 yards or so away, standing almost in the middle of the road. Because of the rise in the road, I could only see this form from the hips up. It was very tall and looked human-like. Very skinny, with long thin arms and skin that was dark, leathery and dry, though there was a sheen to the body. The eyes were a reflective red color. I couldn't tell if it was looking at me or not. There wasn't another car in sight at the time. I'm usually very calm during emergency situations. I'm very interested in unexplained phenomena, but confronting this thing, the panic switch flipped. My mind is telling me to hit the gas, but I just sit there, staring at this thing. I looked down for a second, considering turning around and driving back to my friend's house. I put the car in first gear, looked back up, and the being was gone. I immediately drove towards my house. I was shivering uncontrollably the whole way home. I pulled into the driveway, walked in the kitchen door, and became violently ill. I literally passed out in my bathroom. I didn't wake until about 1 p.m. that day. I dragged myself off the bathroom floor and immediately went to bed. I was totally exhausted and just wanted to sleep. I rarely left the bedroom for the next 5 days. I had no appetite and it seemed like every bone on my body ached. One of my friends eventually came over and helped me into the living room. I ate a little bit, but I was still very tired and despondent. I didn't tell her or anyone else what I had encountered. I just said that I had the flu. Do you have any idea of what I observed out in the desert? Have you heard of similar creatures?
When I was in 3rd grade in 1994, I lived in a small border town called Douglas, Arizona. My dad was in the National Guard and my mom was a stylist. We lived in a new housing development called Quail Run. If you see it now, there are a lot of houses there, but when I was a kid we were one of maybe 6 that were newly built. Quail Run is as far southeast of Douglas as you can get before hitting the Mexican border. I lived in one of the houses on the outer edge of the development. The house faced east, and to the southeast of our front door was miles of desert before hitting Mexico. Plain untouched desert. I remember there was a square hole on Carruthers Street where a new house was going to be built. My older brother and I would always venture out and explore. We were questioned several times by Border Patrol, but as soon as they heard our clean English, they'd leave us alone. I only tell you this because it's important to the events that occurred. There were several of them, and not always of the same nature. I read a lot as a kid, mainly R.L. Stein and scary stories to tell in the dark. I loved, and still do, the creepy stuff. But I knew early on that I didn't believe in ghosts. I never had a ghostly experience or anything like that. But I have had experiences of high strangeness. For example, my brother and I shared a bedroom. We had bunk beds. He slept on bottom and I slept on top. One night I fell asleep and woke up on the bottom. My brother woke up under the bed. See what I mean? High strangeness. One time, we had a lot of stray dogs in Douglas. I saw a stray pass behind a light pole that stood outside our house only to never come out the other end. Maybe less than a foot thick light pole. That was just the small stuff. My stupid brother used to try and scare me by telling me that someone took their own life in our house, which I knew was untrue because I remember our dad taking us to the unfinished house as it was being built. No one could have killed themselves here because we were the first occupants. But even after this, I remember being quite disturbed when my mom found a red splatter stain in the ceiling of her closet. Of course, my brother said it was left over from when someone put a gun in their mouth. I didn't believe that. But I do remember my mother complaining that whenever she would paint over the spot it would seep through. She could never get rid of the spot. One time, near the end of our living in that house, my mom and dad were divorcing. He left to live somewhere else for the time being. My mom, brother, and I came home to find a big webbing crack on our living room window. My mom blamed my dad for the crack. My dad denied it. But that very night, we all decided to sleep together in the living room. My mom slept on the couch. My brother on the recliner. And I fell asleep on the floor between the couch and the coffee table we had in front of the couch. I always, and still do, sleep on my belly. I just can't fall asleep on my back. Anyway, I remember waking up. I can move, but I don't. I can hear something rustling the carpet near me. You know how quiet it can get and you can hear everything. It becomes apparent that something's in the room with us. I try lying still. At this point I'm terrified, but my fear is cranked up when I feel little tickles on my bare back, as though a dog were smelling me and lightly brushing its whiskers on me. It's doing something to my back. These soft little tickles continue until they don't. I remember my mother beside and above me breathing a heavy sigh, and this gives me the courage to get up. I do so, and in the dark I head for the kitchen light switch, which is sort of a part of the living room. Before I reach it I see something run across the floor in the direction of the kitchen. I could only see its shape in the darkness. It was maybe a foot tall or less. It had the shape of a leprechaun or gnome, small, pointed hat or head and thick, chubby. This made me stop, but in less than a second it's gone. I turn the light on and there's nothing. It had run into a dead end in our kitchen and just vanished. This encounter would mirror another that occurred a few months later. My parents officially separated. I'm having trouble at school, getting in trouble a lot. I even tried to punch the principal. My mom sent me to live with my dad and his new girlfriend for about a week. After that week he seemed to have enough of me and my troubles at school, and he sent me back to my mom's. The first night I arrived back I saw that my brother had taken down our bunk beds. He threw out all the connector pieces and made himself a huge bed for himself. 2 box spring mattresses below and 2 regular mattresses on top. Instead of taking my bed back I fell asleep on the floor. We used to always watch Star Trek, The Next Generation right before bed, and I remember watching this before falling asleep. Now our bedroom has a window that also faces east. The light pole was right outside this window and shone an orangish light into the room. We used to have vertical blinds for this window, but as of this particular evening we didn't have them anymore. Now, our bedroom was on the northeast corner of the house. In our room my brother set up his new jumbo bed in the southeast corner of the room with his head pointing south. On the west end of the room we had our closet, and the southwest corner was the bedroom door. I fell asleep on the floor with my feet pointing east toward the window, and my head pointed west almost in the closet. I had a pillow and a this white sheet covering me. I was sort of on my side with the sheet completely covering my head. I could see the bottom half of the orange light that shone in from the light pole. I could see where the bottom of the window ended with the line of a black shadow. I awake in this position. I cannot move. My head is covered by the sheet, but I can still see the shape of the bottom half of the window projected on the sheet. So, keep in mind, I cannot see directly. All I see is the bottom half of the square of light from outside. I can only move my eyes. And that's when I notice something. 3 shadows, like bumps, poke up from the square of light, as if 3 people were peeking into the room and casting 3 shadows in the square of light. My veins are pounding. But I can't do anything but watch. These 3 bumps move even. They turn to each other. I can see their little profiles, lips, nose, forehead. And their lips move as they turn to each other as though they're speaking to each other. I don't remember hearing anything. But I did get the impression that they were very short. These 3 bumps were heads of someone poking their heads in to get a better look. They were their whole bodies. My grandpa on my dad's side had a little foot-tall wooden carving of the Buddha. I remember it reminded me of these little things. The most frightening part was when my brother, only feet away from these things, began to toss a little in his bed and breathe a few heavy sighs. When he did this, all 3 of these things turned their attention to him. Their fat little bodies and profiles all turned to their left, my right, and just watched him as if worried he might wake up. Then they were just gone. They just disappeared. I remember being able to move again and shooting up and turning on the light and searching the room, to my brother's annoyance. Never found anything. But I never forgot it either. I know this is kinda long, but I might as well get it all out there. 2 more significant encounters that happened around this time. I began seeing psycho-people. A psychodot is when you look at a bright light then look at somewhere dark and you see a multicolored blob or dot of residue. I saw that in the shape of people and creatures like bugs and rats. One time while sitting on the curb with my brother at night, I saw something scurry along the curb where the rainwater drains into the sewer. It looked like a rat or bug. The scariest encounter was when my dad came to pick us up for Dairy Queen and I ran into my room to get my shoes and I opened the closet door and saw a psycho-dot person cowering in the corner of the closet, rocking back and forth. Scared the hell out of me. But, just like all the other times, it just vanished. The final thing I want to share is certainly not the last. This happened before the leprechaun-looking thing in the kitchen event. Our bunk beds were still up. We had vertical blinds on our window, though some were missing. The event began very strangely. I told my brother the next morning that my bed sneezed. What I mean is that I was asleep when half of my mattress sprang up like if my brother had kicked it, only he couldn't because the bars were too close together to fit even your hand, let alone his feet. The half of my bed where my head was sprang up for a second then fell back flat. But I was pushed up into a sitting position. This is how I woke up that night. I looked, still half asleep, at the window, and where one of the vertical blinds was missing, I saw a white light. It was far off in the distance. I reached out and pushed open the blinds to the right of that and saw that there were 3 lights, stationary in the far-off sky. 3 lights equally spaced apart, side by side horizontally. I then see from the furthest left light, 2 red lights appear and move further left. They go for a while traveling perfectly straight until they make a 45-degree turn downwards. They seem to go all the way down to the ground before all the lights just faded out. Nothing flew away or blasted off. They just faded out in a split second. And I went back to sleep. Like I said, I told my brother that my bed sneezed because to me it was the best way to describe it. I told my aunt once. She said she saw something similar at her house on the edge of the desert.
While driving one late evening into a Mojave preserve in Southern California in our Jeep, my wife and I noticed what appeared to be a wildfire bordering the perimeter of a small mountain. It was possibly 1/2 mile long and not very deep as the vegetation in the desert is not dense. We instantly tried to call 911 to advise them of the situation but could not make any connection. The area is heavily mineralized with large iron deposits and possibly interfered. To our amazement, as we watched, the fire suddenly and spontaneously went out. We then realized that what we had seen was no fire but the lights within an opening of immense size in the bottom of the mountain. The lights may have been similar to the red lights that Navy pilots are exposed to at night before going to their planes to accustom their eyes to the dark. This may point to a government underground installation rather than an alien structure, but I don't know. We were both stunned and sat there several seconds, then decided it was time to leave. We traveled further into the desert until we found a place to make a U-turn. As we straightened out from the turn, we were suddenly lit up from directly above us with a light that resembled a police helicopter's light but brighter and more intense. The craft from which the light emitted was never visible to me, and it made absolutely no sound of any kind. Nor did it produce turbulence that disturbed the bushes or raised dust, although the craft could not have been more than 75 to 100 feet off the ground. Oddly, I felt no fear or any other emotion other than curiosity. I put the Jeep in park, then stepped out to examine the craft more closely. The instant I was outside the Jeep, however, the craft sped off at an amazing rate of speed and vanished. Just after the craft disappeared, we saw 3 lights approaching us from behind. By now we had grown nervous and fled. The absurdity of fleeing a craft presumably capable of hyperluminal speeds in a Jeep streaking along at nearly 20 miles per hour didn't occur to us at the time. We never saw a body for that craft or the first one, just the lights. Other equally strange events have occurred in that region, so much so that we now have ceased going there. I have not provided more specific indications as to the area's location on purpose, as I believe it to be a dangerous area. The day after this incident, my wife noticed a small spot of blood on my pillow, and upon a close examination discovered an equally small puncture wound behind my right ear.
I hope that you enjoyed tonight's broadcast. If you enjoyed tonight's story, then please subscribe to the channel, as more green texts will appear daily. A new broadcast will appear when the clock strikes midnight Central Time.
Remember to check out the Odyssey page in the description for a second archive of the channel's videos.